My dear students, today I would like to discuss with you a very thought provoking poem by Matthew Arnold, Dover Beach. Dover Beach is a poem written by Victorian poet Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold was a great scholar. He was a critic of the 19th century. He wrote his poems in contrast with the romantic poems of Wordsworth, Shelley, and Coleridge. And he is against subjective expressions in poetry. He is very experimental in his language of poetry. He was originally believed in religious propaganda. He was a man of religion. He had a great faith in Christianity. And he was a great educator, critic, poet. Basically, he was a school inspector for 35 years. And also, later on, he became a professor of poetry at Oxford University and served for near about 10 years. Most of his poetry gives expressions to the conflict of age, that is, between the faith and skepticism. As we all know, by the 19th century, England was prosperous. Industrial revolution took place. As a result, there was a material growth. England was getting rich and rich and rich on different spheres of life. And also, there was a development of science and technology in England. Theories of Charles Darwin and others shattered the original faith of Christianity. Gradually, the culture and the lifestyle, the faith of the people in religion began to shift towards modernity. The poet who was too religious could not tolerate this lack of faith, and he depicted in one of his essays, Culture and Anarchy. He found that anarchy in culture. Culture was degraded from the point of view of a religious perspective. Theory of Darwin, particularly the origin of species, which was a scientific rationalism, and also uh, the development of science and technology disappointed the poet because they were in contrast with the faith. People gradually lack their faith in society, in culture, in religion. So he longed for primitive faith, the ancient faith of Christianity, wholeness, the simplicity and happiness of life. He no longer wants material pursuits, the prosperity of a man or nation. He wants the simplicity of life. He wants happiness than money. He is reflective and philosophical in most of his poems. So, as I told you earlier, he saw anarchy in the society as the result of scientific rationalism and intellectualism. On one side, there was a development of science, another side, there was a growth of intellectual ability, and poet no longer could tolerate the cultural anarchy in the midst of these developments. In such confusion, the clash between science and religion, he assigns a secret and semi-religious status to poetry. So he calls poetry as religious, philosophical. It is a holy means of convincing the moral and religious aspects to life. So, in such confusion, he assigns this sacred status to poetry. More and more, mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. That poetry is the best that has been said and thought in the world. In such era of anarchy, cultural anarchy, Matthew Arnold hoped that it is only the poetry that could bring a man on the right path, that helps him to overcome this anarchy, cultural anarchy, or the scientific progression or material pursuits of life. For Arnold, poetry has both aesthetic and instructional function. It gives us both beauty, truth, as well as it educates the man. So he says, the best poetry, as I told you earlier, the best words in the best order. The best poetry for Arnold is one that embodies Hellenism, that is, old ancient Greek culture. He looks for high seriousness in poetry. He wants meaning, the combination of deep insight and perfect form, such that was found in the poetry of Homer, Dante, Shakespeare. He wanted to make poetry a very high seriousness. He wanted poetry should have a perfect form once it was in the hands of Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. So his poetry is plain and prosaic. And here, Dower Beach is the best example of Arnold's poetry. Matthew Arnold wrote the poem Dover Beach during or shortly after a visit made to Dover region of southeastern England in the year 1851. Just after the marriage, Matthew Arnold went to Dover Beach, which was existed on the southern east of England. He went there along with his newly married wife in 1851 and he stayed in a hotel on the coast. The town of Dover is very close to France than any other port in England. The Strait of England separates the town from the coast of France. There are shifting points of use in narration. The poem has mournful tone of an elegy and the intensity of a dramatic monologue. In the poem, it means you find there is an expression of a poet's deep sorrow over the loss of faith on one side and also his murmur over the new developments in life and culture. That is what we have, the kind of intensity of a dramatic monologue in the poem. The central message of this poem is the loss of faith in society because of scientific postulates, such as the evolutionary theory of English physicians like Erasmus, Charles Darwin, and French naturalist Jean Baptiste Lamarck. Matthew Arnold was a believer in God and religion, but also supported an overhauling of religious thinking in God and Bible. So he wrote in one of the contexts, at the present moment, he says, two things about Christianity Religion must surely be clear to anybody with eyes in his head. One is that men cannot do without it, the other, they cannot do with it as it is. So, it is his humble request that men cannot do anything apart from religion. If they do, if they do, one is that men cannot do without religion, the other they cannot do with it as it is. They can't do. That is why his affirmation is that one must lead a life through the religion. Now pass on to the analysis of the poem Dower Beach. The poem begins with these lines. The sea is calm tonight. The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the strait. On that night, when he was staying with his wife in the coastal belt in the hotel, he calls his wife, looking at the French coast from the English, from the Dover beach. The poet looks at the sea and says, the sea is calm. On that night, the sea was very calm, peace, serene. The tide is full. It was a full moon day. The tide in the beach were full. The moon lies fair. The moon on the other side, it was very beautiful upon the straits. The moon was bending towards the sea. The strait is very narrow, that is, waterway that connects two large bodies of water or canal of water, English coast and the French coast. In the midst of these, he could see the moon who is leaning, bending towards the ocean. That scene was wonderful to look at in that calm night. On the French coast, he says, the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay, far away from the place where Matthew Arnold, looking at the ocean on the French coast, he saw the lights. They were gleams and is gone. The lights were gleams. They were shining one moment and disappearing on another moment. Shining in one moment, disappearing on another moment. This is what happening in reality in English society. Because of the development of science and technology, the faith of man in religion almost it seems gone. This is how the poet is associating the loss of faith with the light at the French coast, which is gleams and is gone, which disappears and appears. This flickering of the light is compared with the loss of faith in the society. The cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay. Bay means ಕೊಲ್ಲಿ ಟ್ರ್ಯಾಂಕ್ವಿಲ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಭೂಪ್ರದೇಶ ನೀರಿನಿಂದ ಆವೃತವಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಥಳಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ. ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ವೆರಿ ಟ್ರ್ಯಾಂಕ್ವಿಲ್. ಟ್ರ್ಯಾಂಕ್ವಿಲ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್ ಕಾಮ್, ಸರೀನ್, ಪೀಸ್ಫುಲ್. The dying light on the coast of France is reminder of the dying light of faith in the poet. Large body of the water here, which is enclosed by land, which is called bay. So, looking at the glimmering light, the poet reminds the glimmering of faith of man in religion. So, in that night, poet invites his wife to the window. Come to the window. Sweet is the night air. There was a very sweet night air. The night air was very sweet. So he calls his darling, his wife, to the window. Come to the window, come to the window. Sweet is the night air only. From the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon blenched land. So on that moment, sea waves hitting the rocks and cliffs are flashing. Cliffs means the the cliffs ಅಂದರೆ ಬಂಡೆಗಳು. ಸಮುದ್ರದ ದಂಡೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಲು ಸಾಲಾಗಿ ಹಬ್ಬಿದಂತಹ ಬಂಡೆ ಸಾಲಿಗೆ ಕ್ಲಿಪ್ಸ್ ಅಂತಾರೆ. ದ ರಾಕ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಕ್ಲಿಪ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ ಸ್ಪ್ಲಾಶಿಂಗ್ ವಾಟರ್ ಇನ್ ಶವರ್ ಇನ್ ಎವ್ರಿ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್. ಜೋರಾಗಿ ಅಲೆಗಳು ಬಂದು ಆ ಬಂಡಿಗೆಲೆ ಹೊಡೆತಿಗೆ ಆ ಸ್ಪ್ರಿಂಕ್ಲಿಂಗು ನೀರು ವಾಟರ್ ಏನು ಸ್ಪ್ರೇ ಆಗ್ತೈತಲ್ಲ ಅದು ಎಲ್ಲ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ಗೆ ಸ್ಪ್ರೆಡ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಆ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಥಳದಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಸಾ ದ ಮೂನ್ ಬ್ಲೆಂಚ್ಡ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್. ದ ಸಿ ಮೀಟ್ಸ್ ದ ಮೂನ್ ಬ್ಲೆಂಚ್ಡ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್. ಸೂರ್ಯ ಮೇಲಿಂದ ಬಾಗಿದ್ದ, ಚಂದ್ರ ಮೇಲಿಂದ ಬಾಗಿದ್ದ, ಕೆಳಗೆ ನೀರು ಮೇಲೆ ಎದ್ದು ಸಿಡಿತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಭೂಮಿ, ಸಮುದ್ರ ಮತ್ತು ಚಂದ್ರನ ಮಿಲನ ಆಗಿ ಕಾಣ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. The poet enjoying the peace and quiet of the night, but his peace of mind is disturbed by troubling of thoughts. Here the poet describes a very beautiful scenery where the moon is meeting the water, the ocean in the midnight, and it was very attractive to look at. The environment is very calm, serene, and tranquil, but the poet's mind inside was troubling with thoughts because he is thinking of the loss of faith among human beings. Further, he says, listen, do you hear the grating roar? He calls, he addresses his wife. Do you hear the grating roars? The uproar that the sound that comes from the ocean of pebbles. Pebbles means stones that are found in the coast, which the waves draw back. Do you listen the sound of the pebbles that waves are drawing them back and fling at their return up the high strand? ಸಿ ಲಿಸನ್ ದ್ಯಾ ಅಪ್ ದ ಹೈ ಸ್ಟ್ರ್ಯಾಂಡ್. ಆ ಎತ್ತರದ ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡು ಹೆಂಗೆ ಅಲೆಗಳು ಕಲ್ಲುಗಳನ್ನು ತಂದು ದಂಡಿಗೆ ಅಪ್ಪಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾವು. ಡು ಯು ಲಿಸನ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್ ಸೌಂಡ್? ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಜೋರಾದ ಅಲೆಗಳು ತಂದು ಕಲ್ಲನ್ನು ದಂಡಿಗೆ ಬಡಿತಾ ಇದ್ದಾವೆ, ಪೆಬಲ್ಸನ್ನು ಬಡಿತಾ ಇದ್ದಾವು. ಆ ಥರ ಮನುಷ್ಯನ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಆಗೈತಿ ಅಂತ ಮ್ಯಾಥ್ಯೂ ಆರ್ನಾಲ್ಡ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾನೆ. ಈ ಕಡೆ ಸೈನ್ಸನ್ನು ಅಪ್ಕೋಬೇಕು, ಈ ಕಡೆ ಧರ್ಮವನ್ನು ಅಪ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ಯಾವುದು ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು? ಧರ್ಮ ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು, ಸೈನ್ಸ್ ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು. ಸೈನ್ಸ್ ನಿಜಾನೋ, ಧರ್ಮ ನಿಜಾನೋ? ಈ ಥರದ ಒಂದು ಕನ್ಫ್ಯೂಷನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಜನ ಇದ್ದರು. ಪೋಯೆಟ್ನೂ ಕನ್ಫ್ಯೂಷನ್ನಲ್ಲಿದ್ದ. ಅದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ದೇ ಆರ್ ಫ್ಲಿಕರಿಂಗ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಒನ್ ಎಂಡ್ ಟು ಅನದರ್ ಎಂಡ್ ಲೈಕ್ ಅ ಫೆಬಲ್ಸ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಕೋಸ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ದ sea. So here you could see the auditory imagery, a very mental picture which is very significant here. The sounds of the fables is compared to men's mind, which are like pebbles on the shore that are swayed, that are moved between belief and disbelief, between faith and skepticism. The grating roar refers to sounds of pebbles rubbing against each other. Which is better? Which is good? Which is to follow? That confusion was prevailing during the Victorian era. The poet is also capturing that moment and compares it to the twinkling moment of this faith in men. Further he says, begin and cease and then again begin. The process is going on, continued. Begin and cease. Sometimes it begins and sometimes it ceases and then again begin. It gives you a space to do the action of the waves with tremulous cadence slow and bring the eternal note of sadness in. In the midst of this gap, the poet is filled with the sad feelings The sound and continuous movement of the waves moving backward and forward, backward and forward, backward and forward in a rhythmic motion. In this rhythmic motion, at the regular interval, the full sea tide and its music remind the poet the sad truth of their word. The rhythmic motion of the ocean, the rhythmic motion of the waves reminds the poet the sad moments that he is witnessing among the mankind, the very confused state of the men between religion and science. So further he says, Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. Sophocles was the 5th century Greek dramatist who wrote a play. In that play, he wrote all about the fate and will of fate of man and will of God. Means the fate of man depends on the will of God, which he reminded to the world. Again, he here refers to the sea or bay in Mediterranean Sea between Greek and Turkey. But the sea between Greek and Turkey is called Aegean, and he wrote a drama on that scene, and he says that in that play, all about the fate and will of gods. Ebb and flow of human misery. The web and flow of human misery is compared to the tides of the sea. Man's fortunes are shifting like tides. So, what the Sophocles, out of his philosophy, his knowledge, said about the fate of Greeks in the hands of the Turks, in the same way, in 19th century England, Matthew Arnold, observing those ebb and flow of human misery in the Dover Beach. So he reminded the words of Sophocles at that moment. Then we find also in the sound a thought. In that sound of the waves, the poet recognizes a thought. What is that thought? Hearing it by this distant northern sea, far away to that distant northern sea, the poet recognizes time and space of that Sophocles, but he experiences the same emotions. He too is disturbed by the thoughts of human misery, like Sophocles. He is also finding certain thoughts in the waves of the ocean. The sea of faith. What the thought the poet reminds here of Sophocles? Sea of faith. Here it is a metaphor. The sea is a metaphorically brought out as a faith. Sea of faith, which was once two at the full. The sea of faith among the human being was very full. It was perfect. Round earth shore lay like the folds of bright girdle furled. Girdle means here long belt. How the sea surrounded the earth like a belt. The faith also prevailed among all human beings in full form. But now, ಆದರೆ ಇವತ್ತು, with the change of the time, but now the poet says, I only hear its melancholy. There is no sea of faith everywhere in the world. I could hear only melancholy, the sorrow, sufferings of the people, long, withdrawing roar. The sea is withdrawing, retreating. ಸಮುದ್ರ ಮೇಲೆ ಬರೋದ ಹಿಂದೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, ಅಂದರೆ ಪ್ರೋಗ್ರೆಷನ್ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಹಿಂಜರಿತ ಕಾಣ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಟು ದ ಬ್ರೆತ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ನೈಟ್ ವಿಂಡ್ ಡೌನ್ ದ ವಾಸ್ಟ್ ಎಡ್ಜಸ್ ಟ್ರೇರ್ naked singles of the world. Here, naked singles means again the pebbles on the shore, the faith retreating from the lives of the people. As the waves taking the faith pebbles into the ocean, so also the faith of the man is retreating, it is going back. ಸಮುದ್ರದ ಅಲೆಗಳು ಹೆಂಗೆ ದಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಬಿದ್ದಂಥ ವಸ್ತುಗಳನ್ನು ಒಳಗಡೆ ಎಳ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗಿ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ತಂದು ಹೊರಗೆ ಅಪ್ಪಳಿಸ್ತಾವಲ್ಲ, ಆ ಥರ ಮನುಷ್ಯನ ನಂಬಿಕೆ ಒಯ್ದಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂತಹ ಸತ್ಯವನ್ನು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳುವಂಥ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಮ್ಯಾಥ್ಯೂ ಅರ್ನಾಲ್ಡ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಮನುಷ್ಯರಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಜ್ಞಾನದ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿಯಿಂದ ಹಾಳಾದಂತಹ ನಂಬಿಕೆಯ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಕೊನೆಗೆ ಮ್ಯಾಥ್ಯೂ ಅರ್ನಾಲ್ಡ್ ಈ ಅಡ್ರೆಸ್ಸಸ್ ಹೀಸ್ ವೈಫ್, ಅವನ ಹೆಂಡತಿಯನ್ನು ಕುರಿತು ಅಡ್ರೆಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಹೇ ಮೈ ಲವ್, ಲೆಟ್ ಅಸ್ ಬಿ ಟ್ರೂ ಟು ಒನ್ ಅನದರ್. ಪ್ರಪಂಚ ಏನಾದರೂ ಯಾಕಾಗಲಿ, ಬಟ್ ನಾನು ನೀನು ಮಾತ್ರ ಇಬ್ಬರು ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದೇ ಭಾವನೆಯಿಂದ ಇರೋಣ. ಲೆಟ್ ಅಸ್ ಬಿ ಟ್ರೂ ಟು ಒನ್ ಅನದರ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಪರಸ್ಪರ ನಾವು ನಂಬಿಕೆಯನ್ನು ಕಳ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು ಬೇಡ, ನಾವು ಮಾತ್ರ ಒಬ್ಬರನ್ನೊಬ್ಬರು ನಂಬಿಕೆಯಿಂದ ನೋಡೋಣ. ಲೆಟ್ ಅಸ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಅ ಫೇತ್ ಬಿಟ್ವೀನ್ ಅಸ್ ಫಾರ್ ದ ವರ್ಲ್ಡ್ ವಿಚ್ ಸೀಮ್ಸ್ ಟು ಲೈ ಬಿಫೋರ್ ಅಸ್ ಲೈಕ್ ಎ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಡ್ರೀಮ್ಸ್. For the world means let us not bother about the world. At least we too will have a faith in us, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams. For the poet, the faith in the future seems to be a land of dreams. So various, so beautiful, so new. So he wants to have a faith with his wife. He wants to make his life more meaningful, more beautiful, more joyful. That's why he says, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, no certitude, nor peace, nor hell for pain. The poet expresses his anxiety that as the people are involved in material pursuits, as they are busy in getting and spending the money, they have lost the faith, they don't have time to enjoy the beauty, there is no change, there is really neither joy nor love nor light. ಯಾರಲ್ಲಿ ಜ್ಞಾನ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಪ್ರೀತಿ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಖುಷಿ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಸರ್ಟನಿಟಿ ಇಲ್ಲ, ನಿಶ್ಚಿತತೆ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಯಾರ ಮನಸ್ಸಿಗೂ ಶಾಂತಿ ಇಲ್ಲ, ನೋ ಪೀಸ್ ನಾರ್ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಆರ್ ಪೇನ್. ನೋವಿನಲ್ಲಿದ್ದವರಿಗೆ ಅಸಹಾಯಕರಿಗೆ ಸಹಾಯ ಮಾಡಬೇಕನ್ನುವಂತಹ ಮನೋಭಾವನೆಯೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಲೈಫೆಲ್ಲ ಕರಪ್ಟ್ ಆಗೈತಿ, ಲಾಸ್ ಆಗೈತಿ, ಹಾಳಾಗೈತಿ. ಅಟ್ಲೀಸ್ಟ್ ನಾವಿಬ್ಬರಾದರೂ ನಂಬಿಕೆಯಿಂದ ಇರೋಣ ಅಂಥೇಳಿ ಈ ರಿಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಈಸ್ ವೈಫ್ ಟ್ರೈ ಟು ಬಿ ಟ್ರೂ ಟು ಫೇತ್ಫುಲ್ ಈಚ್ ಅದರ್. And we are here as on the darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Here the poet gives a picture of the Victorian world, a dark plain where people are struggling for their materialistic ambitions. The world seems to be a dark world, dark plain where people are busy in material gain. Their ambition is to make money. Armies, as once the armies were fighting at night without knowing who and why they are fighting for. ಹಿಂದಿನ ಕಾಲದೊಳಗೆ ಸೈನಿಕರು ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರದ ಮೇಲೆ ದಾಳಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ರು, ಫೈಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಆದರೆ ದೇ ಡೋಂಟ್ ನೋ ಇನ್ ರಿಯಾಲಿಟಿ ವಾಟ್ ದೇ ಆರ್ ಫೈಟಿಂಗ್ ಫಾರ್, ವೈ ದೇ ಆರ್ ಫೈಟಿಂಗ್. ಇನ್ ದ ಸೇಮ್ ಪ್ರೆಡಿಕಮೆಂಟ್ the Victorian people are there, 19th century English people are there. They are busy in material pursuits, but they don't know what they are doing. This is the phenomena prevailed in the 19th century England. This is how Matthew Arnold addresses his wife about the loss of faith and his anxiety for the development. The poem is held together by unity of emotions and sentiments, although there is no connection between the first and second parts. There is no link between one sentence to another, but there is a movement of the emotions and sentiments in the poem. It describes the effects of industrialization, development of science and technology on life of English people. Also, the poet condemns the loss of faith, religion, and the meaning of life resulting from secular thinking. So, because of secular thinking, the poet believes that religion, man has lost his faith in religion. This is what the theme that we could find in this poem. Thank you. Thank you for patience listening.